Wow, thank you. That was the nicest introduction ever. Thank you. And thank you, Sarah. I mean, there aren't many people I can speak animal with, so thank you for understanding my language. And thank you to Copper Colored Mountain Arts. This is just a place filled with magic and goodness, and I'm honored to be here. And Joel, that was fantastic. That was just absolutely breathtaking. So I'm gonna actually begin with two very new pieces. I recently became a stepmother, and I'm also teaching a class on fairy tales. And it turns out the stepmother is not doing too well. So I've been writing a collection of what I imagine to be sort of modern day fairy tales, and this first one's called The Stepmother. You smell like Florida. We hate you. The stepmother knows from the crushed handwriting, this note is from the stepchildren. At the bottom of the note is a drawing of a mouse. The stepmother wants to know, what does the mouse mean? The mouse seems lonely and afraid. Its eyes are too big. The stepmother peels a hard-boiled egg, eats it very quietly, and thinks about the mouse and Florida and smelling like Florida. No one wants to smell like Florida. If the stepmother had any guts, she would go to the yard this instant and paint all the trees white, but the stepmother has no guts. If the stepmother had any guts, her husband, who is the father of the stepchildren who believe she smells like Florida, would come home and see the trees and say, "What in God's name have you done? Do you think we're living in a goddamn fairy tale here?" The stepmother would stand there with her large bucket of paint and her guts and tell her husband, the trees are now white because she is not a real mother, she will never be a real mother, and also she is thinking of running away with the mouse. She would sob and say something strange and dramatic, like how she feels as though she's 3 plagues short of an exodus, even though she doesn't really have any plagues except for smelling like Florida. But none of this will happen because the stepmother has no guts, and this is America, not a fairy tale. This is a state in America that is not Florida, even though the stepmother is reeking of it. The stepmother wants to know, what does the mouse mean? It is a beautiful mouse. The stepmother has no guts, but she does have some scissors, which she uses to cut the mouse out. No one wants to be lonely and afraid and live in a note about smelling like Florida. Once the stepmother cuts the mouse out, the mouse shivers. It is a very sad shiver, sadder than all the stepmother's sadnesses, and somehow this comforts her. The stepmother isn't certain whether the shiver is from coldness or relief, but she cuts off a strand of her hair and wraps it around the mouse's shoulders anyway. The mouse falls asleep in the palm of the stepmother's hand and dreams of guts and white trees and the kindness of the stepmother. The mouse is what the mouse means. It's the stepchildren who mean something else. It's the stepchildren who mean something far, far away, like a mother. When the stepchildren come home, the stepmother will hug and kiss them and wipe their dirty little hands until their hearts break in two. So hot. Is this on?
Yes.
Oh, okay. And this other new piece is called The Very Nervous Family. I come from a family where whenever you call anyone, the first thing they say is, "What's wrong? What happened? What's the matter?" So here's The Very Nervous Family. And it's a series, and this was, I think, this will probably be the first one in the series. Mr. Horowitz clutches a bag of dried apricots to his chest. Although the sun is shining, there will probably be a storm. Electricity will be lost, possibly forever. When this happens, the very nervous family will be the last to starve because of the apricots. Unless, says Mrs. Horowitz, the authorities confiscate the apricots. Mr. Horowitz clutches the bag of dried apricots tighter. He should have bought 2 bags, one for the authorities and one for his very nervous family. Mrs. Horowitz would deadbolt the front door to keep the authorities out, but it is already bolted, already dead. She doesn't like that phrase, deadbolt. It reminds her of getting shot before you even have a chance to run. Everyone should have at least a chance to run, says Mrs. Horowitz. Don't you agree, Mr. Horowitz? Mrs. Horowitz always refers to her husband as Mr. Horowitz should they ever one day become strangers to each other. Mr. Horowitz agrees. When the authorities come, they should give the Horowitzes a chance to run before they shoot them for the apricots. Eli Horowitz, their very nervous son, rushes in with his knitting. Do not rush, says Mr. Horowitz. You will fall and you will die. Eli wants ice skates for his birthday. We are not a family who ice skates, shouts Mrs. Horowitz. She is not angry. She is a mother who simply does not wish to outlive her only son. Mrs. Horowitz gathers her very nervous son up in her arms and gently explains that families who ice skate become the ice they slip on, the cracks they fall through, the frost that bites them. We have survived this long to become our own demise, asks Mrs. Horowitz. No, whispers Eli, we have not. Mr. Horowitz removes one dried apricot from the bag and nervously begins to pet it when Mrs. Horowitz suddenly gasps. She thinks she may have forgotten to buy milk. Without milk, they will choke on the apricots. Eli rushes to the freezer with his knitting. There is milk. The whole freezer is stuffed with milk. Eli removes a frozen half pint and glides it across the kitchen table. It is like the milk is skating. He wishes he were milk, brave milk. He throws the half pint on the floor and stomps on it. Now the milk is crushed. Now the milk is dead. Now the Horowitzes are that much closer to choking. Mr. and Mrs. Horowitz are dumbfounded. Their very nervous son might be a maniac. He is 8. God is punishing them for being survivors. God has given them a maniac for a son. All they ask is that they not starve, and now their only son is killing milk. Who will marry their maniac? No one. Who will mother their grandchildren? There will be no grandchildren. All they ask is that there is something left of them when they are shot for the apricots, but now their only son is a maniac who will give them no grandchildren. Mr. Horowitz considers leaving Eli behind when he and Mrs. Horowitz run for their lives. So, yeah. It's not that far from my family. I'm going to read some poems from my book, Sim Sum. And Sim Sum is basically a Kabbalistic term that it's a term in Jewish mysticism. And the Kabbalists imagine the Sim Sum as this sort of flawed phase in Genesis when, in order for God to affect creation, God must depart from his creation. So, in other words, the creator must always in some way be in exile from the thing that he or she created. And so, well, there are 2 characters that are at the center of this book, and they're Walter B. and Beatrice, and they sort of live in the center of this predicament. They're sort of hatched at the center of its Sim Sum, where they are always sort of in exile from their origins or from the ones that created them, and so they are often asking each other questions about how the world works. And this first poem is called Where Babies Come From. Where, asked Beatrice, do babies come from? Walter B. was hanging a painting in the crawl space. It was a painting of the babies. Basically, said Walter B., babies come from rubbing babies together. They rub and they rub. Once I heard them rubbing. Are you sure those are the babies where babies come from? Asked Beatrice. She was staring at the painting. It was a painting of the babies. Walter B. stepped back. They seem, said Beatrice, to be different babies. Walter B. tilted his head. A door slammed. They stood for a long time and examined the painting. Beatrice was right. These were not the same babies. These were different babies. Some of these babies carried twine. These were not the babies where babies came from. Some of these babies were not rubbing. Some of these babies had books about babies tucked under their arms. These were not the same babies. These babies would never be the babies where babies came from. These babies were different, and Beatrice was the first to call their bluff. So, I had this sort of recurring image in my head of soldiers dressed like children, and how the whole world would suddenly be very different if soldiers dressed like children. So here's the traitor. A few days before the first snow, the soldiers dressed like children began to appear. Come quick, said Beatrice, fetching Walter B. away from his scripture, and bring candy. Walter B. pulled on his robe and joined Beatrice on the balcony. Oh, look, said Beatrice, you can see their small, sweet eyes peeking through the bramble. Walter B. threw a handful of red gumdrops into the air and watched the soldiers dressed like children scatter and raise their arms in glee. Feels sinful, doesn't it, purred Beatrice. They watched them stand in the field and chew. Which one, asked Walter B., do you think is the hero? That one, said Beatrice, definitely that one, the one with the mittens. Yes, agreed Walter B., the others seem less festooned. And which one do you think, asked Walter B., is the traitor? Beatrice bit her lip and looked around. Maybe that one, she said, the one with the orange flower in the pocket of his vest. Walter B. agreed, but to be certain, he thought that he should ask. Little traitor, called out Walter B. The traitor looked up. I knew it, said Beatrice, clapping her hands. The traitor came closer. The wind shook the orange flower loose from his pocket, but he did not run after it. He missed his mother. The traitor came closer, but then he stopped. He curled into his flowerless vest and fell asleep. Walter B. and Beatrice yawned. The soldiers, dressed like children, opened their mouths as wide as they could, but there was no more candy. There would never again be more candy, and so they sailed away to another land. The mistake. A mistake had been made. Should we shoot it? Asked Walter B. Of course, sighed Beatrice, we should not shoot it. It stood in the long grass and blinked at them. Where do you think, asked Beatrice, it came from? From the debacle, I suppose, is all Walter B. said, and then he considered, or maybe from the babies. Beatrice tugged at her sleeves. A mistake had been made, and now Walter B. and Beatrice had on their hands a situation. How, asked Walter B., do you suppose such a mistake had been made? The mistake began to pose as if it heard him. It staggered across the field. For a moment, it looked like a woman bent over nothing in particular, and then it rose, and then it opened its mouth. "Oh, look," exclaimed Beatrice. "It's communicating." "Is it alone?" whispered Walter B., taking Beatrice's hand. "Yes," Beatrice whispered back. "I think it is alone." But it was not alone. It was not alone at all. Others began to emerge, some from the trees, some from the grass. Their damp white mouths flashed in the sunlight. "Had I known a little ahead of time," said Walter B., "I would have changed into my suit." "Yes," agreed Beatrice, "we should have arrived more prepared." "This is exactly what," said Walter B., raising his voice and pointing at the scene in front of them, "I had been trying to explain to you, and now we are in a situation without any rope." "Pardon me," said Beatrice, and she began to walk into the field. Slowly at first, and then faster, and then she began to run. She ran with her arms outstretched, as one might run into a field filled with mothers. So at one point in the book, I started worrying about Walter B. and Beatrice and thinking, like, I started wondering if one of them needed to die. And so I couldn't, and I don't know why, just like your basic sort of plot, right? Like someone has to die, the poet. But so this was my solution. It's called The Creation. The first time Walter B. died, Beatrice announced she would stand in the street until this never happens again. "Until what never happens again?" asked Walter B., embracing her. "Until this," she said. "Until what?" asked Walter B. "This," said Beatrice, shaking herself loose from his arms. "What are you?" asked Beatrice. "New in the neighborhood?" "Yes," said Walter B., "I am new in the neighborhood. That is," he continued, "if it is this neighborhood you are referring to." They looked around. It was, in fact, a new neighborhood. The second time Walter B. died, it was, according to Beatrice, indecorous. A few moments before Walter B. died for the third time, he mourned the fact he would only use the word crepuscular once in his life, and incorrectly. "I would have felt this life more complete," sweet Beatrice, "had that word referred to wonderful party rather than to twilight, as in tonight, my love, I am going to the crepuscular without you." The fourth time Walter B. died, the man who arrived to break for Beatrice the news of Walter B.'s fourth death resembled Walter B., although his appearance was less ambitious than Walter B.'s appearance would have been had Walter B. arrived to break for Beatrice the news of Walter B.'s fourth death. The fifth time Walter B. died, he seemed distracted. "You seem," said Beatrice, "distracted." "What?" said Walter B. "Distracted," said Beatrice. "Oh," said Walter B. "What do you call this?" he asked, holding up one of the children. "A child," said Beatrice. "Oh," said Walter B. "A child." The sixth time Walter B. died, Beatrice investigated the crime. "Who," asked Beatrice, "has done this to you?" Walter B. shrugged. "For God's sake," cried Beatrice, "tell me, was it the children again? Was it me? Who has ruined you?" "If you must know," said Walter B., "it was the collector with his sack of paper animals." "A suffocation?" gasped Beatrice. "No, my little bird," he said, swinging her around by the waist. "It was the most colorful trample I could have ever hoped for." "Wish you were there," he sang. "Wish you could have come with." For 3 days after Walter B. died for the seventh time, Beatrice moved from room to room calling for him for 3 days, and then she stopped. She knew he would die again. He simply has to, she said to herself, hanging his robes in the trees where he would be sure to find them. The saddest gown in the world. I do not give any more, said Walter B., a fig about you. Are you sure? Asked Beatrice. Absolutely, said Walter B. Not a fig? Asked Beatrice. Not a fig, said Walter B. Promise? Asked Beatrice. Promise, said Walter B. When do you suppose, asked Beatrice, you will give about me a fig again? Walter B. looked up at the sky. Probably not for many years, said Walter B. Oh, said Beatrice, should I wait? Of course, said Walter B. You should wait. I'd be very happy, said Beatrice, if you joined me while I waited. Walter B. squeezed her hand. One day, said Walter B., I will make for you a sewing of all the figs I never gave about you. And one day Walter B. would. He would sew all the figs together. It would not be easy, but he would do it. If he could promise Beatrice anything, he could promise her this. He would make for Beatrice a perfect sewing of all the figs he never gave about her. She could wear it, thought Walter B., like a gown, and everyone would applaud. So I'm going to read 2 more poems. And at one point in the book, Walter B. and Beatrice are trying to figure out where their organs have come from. And they decide that the only way that they'll ever figure out where their organs have come from is to join the organization. And one of the rules in joining the organization is they have an oldest animal, and in order for them to join the organization, they need to lead their oldest animal out of their house where it had been kept for a very long time, and brush the doorpost with its leftover fur, and so the oldest animal is let out, and many poems later, the oldest animal starts writing letters back to Walter B. and Beatrice. And so the last 2 poems I'm going to read are called The Oldest Animal Writes a Letter Home. They're both called that. And thank you for listening again. To that mutter and that fodder. It is of the utmostly import that I rotted you, conserping the whereaboutlings of that mutter's imagination. I seep it daily running to and froth. Something is wrong with it. Why does it says a revolution is in order as it rubs its tears away with the grasses? Was it that mutter who is also called Beatrice, who hath given it the wit-fur coat it sheds all over the forest and the skies? That same mutter who hath given me all the outside parts of the world. On a certain evening when I was scared, that mutter's imagination really brought me the herrings and the marmalades. We ate it, all of it ups under the moops and the starps. In the mouth, the herrings and the marmalades tasted like words scraped off the bones of that mutter if she is misting me. That mutter's A laughed and laughed when I said that idea out Lord. That mutter's A laughed so open I could seep into its mouth all the way down to the inside of its feet. A ghastling wind shakes from there. Even I, the oldest animal, can hear the ghastling wind saith all my things at once. Remember when that fodder, who is also called WB, said that mutter's A should stand in the corner and think about what it did? What does it do? Nothing, mostling, except for all the winds and the herrings and the marmalades. Hence froth and overwise I am so far-fetched, especially regarding all the signage pointing to the factuals that I, the oldest animal, am no longer with vicinity to that mutter and that fodder who is you. I am older than Poland today, but not more sadly. You did know me once, didn't you? Please send birds. Sincerely, the oldest animal, cited in contents. To that mutter and that fodder. You never sended birds, unless nothing is the birds you sended, which was not the birds I meant. Even if the one with the tooths, who is also called the collectora, brings them in the jar, those is not the birds I meant. Or if I was fastly awake under the grandfather tree when one terrible water falled from the woolly skies, those is not the birds I meant. And neither is the parsnips, although one of the parsnip has the littlest feather on the tops of its heads. That parsnip is mated out of magics I obey. I think I loveth that parsnip, but none's of it is those birds I meant. At last I invented some ideas if that mutter and that fodder is wondering how. Collect the birds off the roof and out of the attic, and swore to them out, Lord, that thy oldest animal shall be thy witness forevermores and at last. And if it is scared, said unto that bird, the oldest animal is scared too. And if it shaketh in thy flesh, said unto that bird, the oldest animal shaketh in thy flesh too. And if it is a lostling, if that soreless parsnip will never loveth back, said unto that bird, the oldest animal is a lostling too. I mated myself a prayer against forgetting me. I rasp it out, Lord, with one hoof's in the air and one hoof's on my heart's. It says its words like this: something beautiful is going to happen. Something beautiful is going to happen. Something beautiful is going to happen. Sincerely, the oldest animal, cited in contents. Thank you.